Hello, everyone, and welcome to the My Healthy Home Summit. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Caroline Blazovsky. I'm a national healthy home expert and an environmental residential consultant with over 24 years of experience. This summit is designed to educate you about the process of creating a healthy home, to learn how our homes may affect our health and wellness, and the benefits associated with living and working in healthier spaces. We have compiled the most decorated speakers in this arena to help you on your journey. Today, we will be joined by guest Dr. Jamie DeWitt, who will be discussing forever chemicals and their immune effects on us, and why we need to be aware of these chemicals and reduce them to create a healthy home. Welcome, Dr. Jamie DeWitt. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here.
So, as a leading toxicologist, can you start by giving me a quick synopsis about your background and how you got into this industry? Usually, people have quite an interesting story.
Well, I don't know if my story is interesting in as much as it is serendipitous. I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian when I was in high school. And then when I got to college, I discovered that there were so many more options available. So I kind of wandered around the biological sciences until I finished my bachelor's degree and then didn't know what I wanted to do. Ended up with a job in health and safety and learned about toxicology. And the more I learned about toxicology, the more I realized that it was the perfect science for me because it blended together many different sciences and also enabled me to learn a little bit about policy and law. So I did a PhD in environmental science and then ended up getting a second PhD in neuroscience not by design, but by accident because I was close to credits. And then I did postdoctoral training at the US EPA in immunotoxicology. So I understand how the environment works to a great degree, and then have a pretty deep understanding of how our nervous system and our immune systems work and how environmental contaminants can impact them.
So, our summit is about healthy homes, obviously, and creating healthier spaces for us to live. But this also translates into our workspaces, it translates into lots of different environments. So, when we're talking about homes in particular, what are some things from your perspective that we need to really be looking at? What types of chemicals are in our homes or things in our water that may really contribute to poor health?
There are so many physical items in our homes that can off gas different chemicals and lead to exposure inside of our homes. These chemicals can also contribute to the dust inside of our homes, so we can breathe them in directly or breathe them in through dust. Some of these are in the textiles that we might bring into our homes, but some are also in some of the adhesives and finishes that may be on our flooring. They can be in the paints that we put onto our walls. I'm most interested in the chemicals that can get into our homes through the water that we drink, through our drinking water. So I think one of the really important things that people can do in their home environment is to figure out where their water comes from. Do you have a private well, which has different sets of regulations on it than if you're getting your water from a public utility? So knowing where your water comes from and knowing its source will be one step that you can take to understand what contaminants you might be getting exposed to in your drinking water. We all need water to drink, so it's a very important resource, and it's important that we understand what could be in our water.
So, what types of contaminants are you seeing? Let's talk water a little bit in relationship to water.
Well, if we think about how water sanitation started around the world and really started here in the United States, it was designed to eliminate pathogens from our water. So, bacteria and viruses that could make us acutely sick. Think about cholera. Cholera it produces a toxin that usually leads to very great gastrointestinal upset. And during some of the cholera outbreaks, an understanding emerged about the role of these pathogens and diseases and how important water sanitation was. So, most of our water treatment facilities here in the United States were designed to eliminate pathogens or at least to reduce pathogens. The vast majority of our water treatment facilities were not designed to reduce or eliminate or treat many of the different types of chemicals that we use in our society today. Now, many of them have been retrofitted with technologies that can either break down or filter out certain types of chemicals, but many of the chemicals that we may have in our homes that get into our bodies and then go out into the water may come back into our homes. For example, A growing area of environmental concern are the pharmaceutical and personal care products that we use. For example, think about people who are considered to be baby boomers. Many people in that age area are consuming or having to take for their health many different types of pharmaceutical drugs. Statins, for example, to help people control cholesterol. Those uses are growing, which means more people are taking them into their bodies, more people are excreting them, and then those get into wastewater, which then comes back to us in our drinking water. So some of these pharmaceuticals are growing as chemicals of concern that we might be consuming in our homes through our drinking water because our treatment systems aren't necessarily designed to clean those out. We also have industrial chemicals and other chemicals in consumer products that can get into our drinking water.
I think I remember hearing a story about Lake Mead, I believe, and that the fish were actually starting to, or the male fish were starting to exhibit symptoms that they weren't supposed to have because of the amount of birth control that was in the water. Is that correct? Are those the types of things that can happen?
Yes, there have actually been some, and they're called ecosystem or sometimes mesocosm studies, where you can actually introduce chemicals into ecosystems in a very controlled way to look at what could happen to the wildlife that is living in that ecosystem. There have been some studies done on lakes that have high concentrations of estrogens or estrogenic chemicals, birth control, for example, and we see either collapse of certain fish populations, they die out because they can't reproduce anymore, or you can see shifts in the sexual organs of the animals. I think there have been some studies of salmon here in the Pacific Northwest that have shifted from male form to female form because they live near sewage effluent or wastewater treatment effluent that has these estrogenic chemicals in it.
So, how does that affect us? So, say we're in our homes, we're drinking the water, we don't have filtration. And then we can kind of get to that too, like how you feel about filtration and should everyone be filtering their water. But how could these things potentially affect us in our physical bodies?
So some of the chemicals that I've talked about, I said estrogenic. We call these endocrine disrupting chemicals. So estrogen is a hormone, is part of our endocrine system. We have many other endocrine organs, our thyroid gland, our pancreas, our liver even produces some hormones, our ovaries and testes. So these are some of the major endocrine glands that we have. And we understand that some of these endocrine disrupting chemicals or EDCs can produce effects at very low concentrations, especially in developing organisms. There were some really elegant studies done by some scientists in the 80s and 90s to understand just how potent hormones are during development. For example, there was a professor at one of the universities in Missouri who was looking at rats in his laboratory, and he found that if you were a male rat who was growing between two female rats in the uterus, you would have characteristics as you developed and became sexually active that were more what we would call female like than male like because of the hormones you were receiving from your sibling during development. So, this study demonstrated that hormones are very, very potent at very low concentrations. There have also been studies of populations around the world that have been showing shifts in sperm levels, shifts in fertility, and there are some who blame these on the endocrine disrupting effects of these chemicals that we get exposed to in the uterus. In North Carolina, for example, where I lived before I moved out here to the Pacific Northwest, the number one birth defect behind congenital heart defects is something known as hypospadias. This is a disorder where the opening of the penis, which should be at the tip of the penis, actually occurs on the underside of the penis, and it can be more or less severe. And it is thought that this arises from the lack of appropriate hormone signals during development. North Carolina happens to be a highly agricultural state, so there's a lot of pesticide use and a lot of chemical use in the state. So there are concerns that some of the hormones that are chemicals such as pesticides that people get exposed to during development could be having effects on our sexual development and our development of our other organs.
So many questions. So one, let's like we're talking water right now. Is there anything we can do or filtration that can protect us? I mean, what can homeowners do? Because you're sort of our water supply is something that we don't actually have control over except if we're filtering in our home, right? We're kind of at the mercy of the treatment plant or we're at the mercy of a well and we need to make sure that we're testing in those cases. I think in our homes it's so important that we're actually actively testing. One, what do you recommend testing? How often homeowners should test? And two, what do you think about protection for us?
So a lot of that really depends on whether you own your well and it's a private well or if you're getting your water from a public utility. Arming yourself with information, of course, is one of the best resources that we have for knowing what actions we need to take. So if you're on a public water supply, you should be able to get information from your public utility if it's of a certain size about what contaminants they test for and at what levels they're at in your water. There's also a nonprofit organization known as the Environmental Working Group that has a tap water database. So you can look up your city and you can look up your water treatment facility in their database, and you can see what types of chemicals they've reported as being measured in their water. Now, a lot of these data come from what's known as the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule. This is something that the US EPA does every so often to get a handle on types of contaminants that might be in our public water systems. It's through the Safe Water Drinking Act and something known as the Candidate Contaminant List, which is probably way more policy information than most people want to know. But there's lots of information out there if your water comes from a public utility. And you can be confident that your utility is meeting all applicable standards for all regulated chemicals. The big question is, well, what about those unregulated chemicals that are in my water, but for which we have no protective guidelines? Fortunately, many of the treatment modalities that water treatment facilities have in place now do a pretty good job of breaking down or filtering out many of these chemicals that I've just talked about. If you're still not confident, there are steps you can take in your home. You can do reverse osmosis. You can do that at a point of use, at a faucet, for example, or you can have a whole house reverse osmosis system. But this is pretty expensive. So for many homeowners, it might be somewhat cost prohibitive. You can use a carbon based filter. These are some of the pitcher filters or refrigerator filters that you might have. These contain granular activated carbon, which can capture a lot of those contaminants, but you have to be very diligent about changing the filter when it's recommended that you change it, because think about it, it's kind of like a sponge. It can only hold so much of those contaminants before it gets filled and those contaminants start coming back out into your water. Now, if you're a private well owner, then really it's the testing and the cost of that testing is your responsibility. Most county departments of public health have recommendations for how often your private water supply should be tested for pathogens. And many departments of public health have recommendations about labs where you can send your water samples for testing. Some will do it, and some will do it at a free or reduced cost for certain homeowners. So you'd have to see what's recommended by your county Department of Public Health. For chemicals, that also is going to depend. I think there are some recommendations that you do pathogen testing about every year, every other year, and chemicals testing, I think every 2 to 5 years, again, depending on your county. But very often homeowners are going to be responsible for those costs. And similarly, like somebody who gets their water from a public utility, homeowners can decide to put in various filtration systems. I do also want to point out that in some areas where there are known water contaminants, some homeowners who are on private water may be able to get treatment as part of legal proceedings against entities that have polluted the water. So that's also worth investigating if you're in an area where you think there's been some known contamination that may make you eligible for some water treatment opportunities.
So, what are some of the chemicals that we need to be concerned about? So, I mean, specifically, like we're talking We hear a lot about PFAS, these forever chemicals, right, that have a really long breakdown process. We also hear about them in indoor air quality, what we call semi-volatiles, right, things that have to break down at a much higher temperature and just don't have the ability to break down in our homes. So, can you kind of give our audience, because we've got people of such vast knowledge in this topic, some little knowledge, some a lot. So, just kind of tell them about these chemicals and maybe how they get into our homes and then why they're so problematic.
Sure. So I've already talked a little bit about endocrine disrupting chemicals or EDCs. That the other chemicals that you've mentioned, we would broadly classify those as persistent organic pollutants or POPs. These can include per and polyfluoroalkyl substances or PFAS, can also include polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons or PAHs. It may also include certain types of pesticides, and depending on where you live, maybe polychlorinated biphenyls or dioxins or furans or flame retardants. So it's just this mix of organic chemicals that we consider to be persistent that can get into our water and then get into our homes through our drinking water or even into our homes through some of the products that we might bring into our homes. I can talk a lot about PFAS or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances because they're a chemical that I'm studying in my lab right now, or they're a class of chemicals that I'm studying in my lab right now. PFAS are among the most persistent of the POPs that we've identified to date. When I was in graduate school, I was looking at the neurodevelopmental effects of PCBs and dioxins, and these can break down in the environment in about 15 to 30 years. And when I was in graduate school, we thought, wow, that's a really long time for a chemical to remain in the environment. PFAS don't have a real we don't really have an idea of how long it will take for a PFAS to break down in the natural environment. It could be hundreds of years. I've heard some scientists say breakdown of PFAS could be on a geologic time scale. And the reason is that the bond between carbon and fluorine is very, very strong. So PFAS is a string of carbons, and normally when carbons hang out, they have hydrogens attached to them. Well, PFAS were synthesized, so people made PFAS. They don't occur in nature. Somebody in a lab said, what happens if I take the hydrogens off the carbons and replace it with fluorine? Well, carbon and fluorine like each other a lot. So that's one of the reasons that PFAS have certain values in industrial and consumer processes and products, but that's also a reason that they are so persistent in the environment. That environmental persistence also means that they tend to be persistent in our bodies. So if you ingest certain types of PFAS today, you may have half of that PFAS in your body for up to 8 years, maybe even longer for
Mm,
some. And we
mm,
think that there are about 14,000 plus individual PFAS. So people might hear about PFOA, which is perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOS, which is perfluorooctane sulfonic acid. That's only two of this huge class of chemicals. And they may have different levels of persistence. Some might persist in bodies for days, some might persist for years, but we're exposed to many different PFAS in our food, in our water, in our air, in the soil, in products that we bring into our homes. So the big question is, how do I get rid of PFAS? If I have them in my body, how do I minimize PFAS that I have in my homes? And hopefully I can provide a few answers about that. And I can go on if you'd like, or we
yeah.
can we
So
can ask
where?
some more
So
questions.
where? I mean, are we currently? I mean, have they? I mean, I'm assuming they're still in products currently today. Is that correct? We're using them even though we know they're so bad.
Yes, that's correct. Now, there have been some phase outs and some restrictions of certain PFAS. For example, PFOS, I mentioned the perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, was a major constituent in Scotchgard. The company that makes it, that's the 3M company, voluntarily phased out PFAS in the early 2000s. And as far as I know, 3M is getting out of the PFAS business, and they will no longer make or use or add PFAS into their products I think either this year or next year, they released a statement, I think last year, indicating that they're out of the PFAS business. Now, PFAS still are used in many different products and processes. Uh, for example, my new office here was recently painted. It is very likely that there were PFAS in the paint that was applied to the walls in my office. So as I sat in my office and breathed in the paint fumes, I likely got exposed to PFAS. I also wear contacts every day. There are data to indicate that PFAS are in contact lenses. So you're probably wondering, okay, they're in paints and in contacts. Why are they in both of these very different products? Well, part of it is that carbon fluorine bond strength, but PFAS also make surfaces slippery. So they're used to make non-stick, water repellent and stain repellent coatings. And in something like paint, it helps the paint to go on more smoothly. Something like my contact lens, it makes it so that my contact slides nice and easily over my eyeball, which I appreciate, but then I don't really know if I want PFAS that close to my brain. So I think for many PFAS, we kind of have to decide as a society what ones are essential for our health and safety and functioning, and which ones can we do without. And this is actually a question that is being considered by states and decision makers at the federal level here in the United States and in other countries.
In homes, I know cookware is a big issue. Have they sort of eliminated that out of cookware, or is it still readily available in cookware?
So, nonstick cookware may contain PFAS. It really depends on the company that makes it and the type of nonstick coating. Uh, Teflon, for example, is made by a company known as Chemours, and they do use PFAS in making Teflon. Teflon is a fluoropolymer. Polytetrafluoroethylene is the fancy chemical name, and PFAS are used to make fluoropolymers. There are some technologies where fluoropolymers can be made without a PFAS surfactant, but as far as I know, for Teflon, PFAS still are being used to make Teflon. But there are other ways to create nonstick coatings. For example, I had an egg for breakfast this morning, and I have a stainless steel pan. I used a little bit of butter, and the egg slid right out, and it tasted delicious because it had some butter on it. And for people who are concerned about uh, cooking with butter, there are olive oil sprays that you can use, and there are other types of cookware, ceramic, for example, that have relatively nonstick coatings that would then allow you to use a pan that doesn't have PFAS in it. There are some companies that advertise as being PFOA free, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're PFAS free. It just means that nonstick coating was made without one of the PFAS. You would have to research the company to see if their coating is truly made without PFAS. And sometimes it's hard to get that information because it's not always readily available.
Let's talk about that for a little bit. Being a toxicologist, when people, and we're trying to encourage homeowners, when they're looking at information, whether you're buying building products or personal care products, we know a lot of these things are under the guise of proprietary information. The companies are able to kind of keep us from them. Um, how can we really find out? Where can we find out if these things are in the product? And then also, how do we find better products? And I know this is hard because there really aren't a lot of regulations. So you can kind of talk about that too. A lot of things just in our homes are not regulated. We think they are, but they aren't.
Well, I think it's really frustrating too, because why should all of this pressure get placed on individual consumers to get information about the safety and potential toxicity of a product that you might bring into your home, put on your body, put into your pets and your children and your loved ones? So it's, I think, sometimes very overwhelming, to the point where some people may go, you know what, there's just no point. There's so much chemical activity around me. I can't control it. So I'm just going to
Yeah.
take that risk. It really would be nice if we did have a readily available clearinghouse of information, but I understand it can be very complex. For example, I went to a retreat a few years ago that brought together scientists and policymakers and then sustainability officers from private companies. And I was talking to a sustainability officer from a flooring company. There's a company that makes vinyl floors and carpetings and textile-based floors. And I said, well, what's so complicated about a piece of carpeting that you put into your home? And he said, actually, carpeting, for example, has multiple layers. So there's adhesive, there's backing, there's carpeting, there's the padding, and all of these different layers often come from different suppliers. So his job as a sustainability officer was to try to figure out what chemicals were in each of the layers. That meant reaching out to multiple suppliers, and some suppliers aren't always really going to hand over their chemical list right away. So they had to come up with strategies to get information from their suppliers about what chemicals were used to make those materials so that they could make that information available to their consumers. So the supply chain for something that seems pretty simple is actually really complicated. But then again, I as a consumer shouldn't have to go through all the hassle of figuring that out. It should be readily available, but it's not always readily available to the manufacturers of products. So I think I just kind of made the situation even more confusing. I don't even know the best answer for consumers to get
It's
information.
I think the answer is that we have to be vigilant and start realizing that our best interests are not looked after. There's just no governing body in place that says products that we're bringing into our home, whether that's your wallboard you're using, your carpeting, like you talked about, your cabinetry, we don't know. And there aren't a lot of laws and regulations that prohibit these types of chemicals and even look after us as to what these chemical companies are utilizing in our homes. I mean, we're starting to see more, but we've talked about in other discussions that, low VOC, no VOC, zero VOC. A lot of these are marketing things that don't even exist. There's no way to have a paint be no VOC. It's just impossible. So it puts so much on us as consumers. And I think that's why you're here, to put some clarity and then to also get people to understand that it is our responsibility to start looking and asking for these better products. Um, so let's talk a little bit about, outside of water, what types of things can end up in the air in our environments, and are these things, do we just breathe them in? Do they come in through our skin? How do these forever chemicals get into our body? Is it inhalation? How does that process work?
Well, specifically with respect to PFAS and how they can move around in the environment, it it depends on the PFAS. There are some PFAS that we consider to be volatile. In other words, they can move from soil or water into air very easily. But we understand that many PFAS can be in the air. For example, some researchers from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency wrote a really nice paper a few years ago where they looked at PFOA and then its replacement in Teflon production. It's known colloquially as Gen X. So they measured PFOA and Gen X in soil uh, around a facility in West Virginia. This was it's in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and it's Keymore's facility. There was a movie made about it called Dark Waters, and so they went to this facility and started sampling soil around the facility just to see how far away from the facility they could detect PFOA and Gen X. And they went out 40 kilometers, which, which is, I don't know the math, which is a good number of miles.
It's far.
Yeah, like maybe 90 or so miles, and they still found PFOA and Gen X. So we know that chemicals like PFAS that are in the water can sometimes get into air. And even if you don't live right next to a facility that's making them or using them, you may still get exposed through the air that you breathe. Now, we don't have a lot of data on the health effects that can arise when you breathe in PFAS. We also don't have a lot of data on the health effects that could arise if you absorb PFAS through your skin. There's only been a handful of what we call dermal exposure studies, and some of them suggest that PFAS might not absorb very well, but we have so few studies that I don't feel confident saying it's not a problem. We don't have enough data to say if it is or isn't a problem. Same thing with inhalation exposure. We do know, though, that there have been studies of dust in firehouses where PFAS-containing firefighting foams may have been stored or used or mixed, and we can find PFAS in dust in firehouses. There's a professor at Duke University named Heather Stapleton who has developed a method for detecting PFAS in hand wipes. So she can go into homes and take hand wipe samples from adults and children, and she's detected PFAS in these hand wipe samples. So we know that PFAS can get out of products, get into dust, get onto hands. And if you're a child, your fingers are in your mouth all the time. So there's the potential for that dust to get ingested. So we can get exposed to PFAS through many different routes. What the way that most of us get exposed is likely through our diet. If you live in an area where there's a point source of PFAS pollution to water, the majority of your exposure is going to come from that contaminated water. If you work with PFAS, that will be your major source of exposure. But for the vast majority of us, it's likely to be from our diet. But again, inhalation and dermal absorption are poorly studied right now. We don't have enough information to rule those out as being, significant sources of our exposure.
And so what types of symptoms, if someone were to have a buildup of PFAS in their body, what type of diseases? Are we looking at things that are carcinogenic or neurotoxicity, or what types of symptoms would develop in people who have this?
Yeah, so PFAS, as far as we know, don't produce any acute or immediate symptoms after exposure. It's not like, you breathe a solvent and can feel dizzy and lightheaded. PFAS don't produce those short-term symptoms. Most of what we understand about the health effects of PFAS tells us that they contribute to chronic disease risk. So many of the diseases that I don't want to say become comfortable with, but that we kind of take for granted just occur in the population. These are certain types of cancers. So the cancers that have been most strongly linked to PFAS exposure are testicular cancer and kidney cancer. But there have been some studies that link prostate cancer, bladder cancer, breast cancer, and even other cancers. We have studies that have demonstrated that if you're exposed to PFAS while you're developing, you might be born at a lower birth rate. So there's an increased risk of reduced birth weight. And babies that are born below a certain weight tend to have lifelong problems because of that low birth weight. We know that some studies have tied exposure to PFAS to a reduced response to vaccinations, and that's one of the endpoints that I study in my laboratory. It's a signal that your immune system isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. Other studies have linked PFAS to elevated cholesterol in the blood, to increase risk of liver damage because of elevated liver enzymes. There's also some studies to suggest that exposure might be associated with thyroid disease, ulcerative colitis, and then a placental disorder known as pregnancy-induced hypertension and preeclampsia. So many different types of chronic diseases.
And so when we're talking about forever chemicals, or POPs, I always loved persistent organic pollutants. It was one of my favorite words when I was studying any kind of toxicology. What other chemicals are we talking about in these categories? So what can be in a home that we might be subjected to?
Well, you've mentioned polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or VOCs. These are volatile organic materials. Solvents can be in adhesives, paints, cleaners. We also have quaternary ammonium compounds that can be in cleaners, and the use of those types of compounds really increased when the pandemic was at its height because of people wanting to eliminate those types of risks in their home, risks from the COVID virus. I think many people use pesticides in their homes, and pesticides can be insect sprays or sprays to kill weeds or to repel insects. So you can get exposed to persistent organic pollutants if you bring pesticides into your homes. And then many of our furniture and some of our clothing items may have flame retardants in them. These are polybrominated flame retardants. And some older homes might have certain types of heavy metals. Metals can also be persistent, although they're not organic unless they're bound to a carbon compound in some way. So there's many different types of chemical classes that can be in our homes that we would consider to be persistent or persistent organic pollutants.
We talked a little bit about water filtration. How does air filtration, and this may be in your wheelhouse or not, does air filtration actually help us? Are there ways to filter these things out? Are they even effective? I mean, obviously, the best method is always abstinence, right? Trying to avoid them. But when we don't know they're there, are there any filtration methods that can work to help us in homes?
I don't think I know the answer to that. So I know some of these compounds can be detected with either passive or active air sampling devices, and these
Sure.
have filters that can detect really teeny tiny particles and then bigger particles. And I think some of these can be some chemicals can be linked to the bigger particles. I think a home filter that you have may filter out some chemicals, but I don't think I really know the answer to that. That's not something that I've looked into, but I think after we finish, I'm going to see what I can find out.
Well, it's just interesting because as homeowners, right, we need to, I mean, the first thing is education, and that's why we're doing the summit, right? And we all have to start asking for, requesting, making sure that these companies are aware that we as consumers know that there are products that are better, worse they're better or worse than others, and that we request these products start really being, or companies really start being more vigilant about what they're putting into their products. And that's the goal of the summit, right? It's to get people educated, like this is going on, just like we got concerned about organics or organic food, non-GMO. This is the same thing, right? Our homes have become a garbage pail, if you will, for every toxic thing that we bring into it. And from looking at houses for the last almost 25 years, I see this as a major problem. And that's why, we've asked you to come here and talk about what's ending up in our homes, and how we can potentially start to change the direction as to how we're going. Um, we're about 37 minutes in, and I like to do a little fast round. And this is so people can kind of learn about you a little bit, because it's always fascinating to see what the experts do in their homes and how you operate in the world. So, what is your favorite room in your house?
Oh gosh. So we just moved in October and we're in a rental house. I don't know if I have a favorite room yet. I guess I would have to say it's the kitchen because that's where I spend most of my time when I'm at home. That may change when we move into our forever home in the near future.
And what are some of the or your favorite activities that you like to do in your home?
In my home, I'm a big reader. I'm also a big organizer. If I can't sleep at night, I dream about how I'm going to reorganize closets and drawers and how I'm going to organize furniture that helps to soothe me. So, but when I'm immediately outside of the home, I like to do a little bit of gardening. I don't really grow any edible food, but I like to grow, well, herbs and flowers, things to help pollinators. I like that.
And that brings up a question too. I always like when we do this round because it kind of strikes on different things. How are these chemicals affecting, right? We talk about pollination. How are these disturbing or affecting not just humans, but our animal populace?
Well, in terms of PFAS, we can detect PFAS in many different types of wildlife. They've been detected in polar bears, they've been detected in colonial fish eating water birds along the coast, they've been detected in fish. At this point, I don't know if we have a really good handle on how they're impacting wildlife in terms of their ability to reproduce or survive, but undoubtedly they're part of the chemical mixture that wildlife get exposed to, and wildlife may be suffering as a result, as well as people who have increased health risks from their exposure.
Mm. So another question is how what is something, and this is you're in a rental home, so it might be different than if it was your regular home, but what is something in your home environmentally that you need to correct, or a problem that you see and you say, I've got to make a change here.
Well, one of the things that my spouse and I have been slowly trying to phase out our plastics in our home. For example, we don't use plastic storage bags for our food leftovers anymore. We use glass or we use silicone. We have also transitioned out our plastic cutting boards and have sustainable wood cutting boards that I've coated with beeswax. I love my cutting boards. They're beautiful, and sometimes it makes me not want to use them because they're so pretty. So we've really been trying to phase out plastics, but quite a few years ago, we phased out commercial cleaning products. So I make all of my own cleaning products, and we've also transitioned to laundry detergent strips that come in cardboard recyclable packaging instead of liquid and plastic. And we also switched to toothpaste tablets that come from a company that does sustainable packaging. So our bits come in compostable packaging and recyclable
Hmm.
packaging. And what's really funny is that my spouse likes them because he doesn't have to think about how much toothpaste to put onto his toothbrush anymore. I never realized that was such a challenging decision for him to make every day.
You're saving the world, and he's worried about his toothpaste consumption
I
and how much
know.
he eats. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Um, so that's amazing, actually. And can you tell people about plastics a little bit? Why you're choosing to eliminate them from your home, and what's so bad about them? And then also touch a little bit about in the news lately, we've heard about water, right, being in plastic and people drinking water from plastic. Can we touch on that a bit?
Sure. So I think one of the main reasons we decided to start phasing out plastics is that they're petroleum based and there's a lot of different chemicals that go into plastics. As I look around my office, I see a lot of plastic. I'm trying to eliminate it in the workplace as well. It's pretty challenging in a laboratory to get rid of plastics because of
I bet.
the need to have things that are disposable.
Disposable.
It's one of the negative aspects about doing laboratory research. But we really wanted to get away from chemical based storage and wanted to help to reduce chemicals into the environment. So we were wanting to reduce our plastic use at home for those reasons. But something else we learned about is that when you have certain types of plastics in your home, for example, our cutting boards, every time we cut on it, we were probably releasing small bits or nano or micro particles of plastic into our food and then ingesting those micro or nanoplastics. So those types of plastics are now emerging as pretty big environmental concerns. One of my good friends runs the Center for Marine Debris Research. She has to live in Hawaii to do this, but she
Um,
and her team look at plastic debris in the ocean and plastic debris that can be inside of the bodies of living organisms. For example, I donated to our center one year, and in return, I got a piece of art. The piece of art that they sent me is made from hunks of plastic that they either retrieved from the ocean or from inside the bodies of living organisms. And these are pretty big chunks of plastic, but there are also really small chunks of plastic that we call micro or nano. And we know that they can interact with molecules in our bodies, and those interactions can produce changes in our physiology that may increase the risk of diseases. So that's one of the major emerging concerns right now with plastics is that when they degrade into these small and small and smaller bits that then can be ingested and may produce adverse health outcomes. We're still learning about those.
and so many people like to have water that their water quality may actually be pretty decent, but they choose to drink from a plastic water bottle thinking, oh, I'm worried that my tap water coming into my tap because of chlorination and fluoride and all of these different things that they worry about, it's safer to drink plastic water bottle. How do you feel about that? Do you think tap water is as bad as people say? You think it's safer to drink tap water than to drink bottled water?
Well, I try to avoid bottled water in plastic bottles because the plastic bottle is an environmental cost, right? It has to be produced, it has to be disposed of. So I try to use metal or glass containers. If I'm traveling, I always have a metal water bottle with me. I have great trust in my tap water because I know that my public utility is going to do everything possible to meet applicable standards. a company that bottles water may not have those same types of regulations. And if you buy water in a plastic bottle, do you know where it's coming from? Do you know what filtration or treatment that that company is applying to the water? So you might be getting water that is actually less safe
Yes.
for you than your tap water unless you know if it's been tested for contaminants like your public utilities does. Has it been filtered or treated in any way? Some bottled water is reverse osmosis treated, but some is not. And I know that there have been some nonprofit organizations that have looked at contaminants in bottled water and they've detected contaminants in bottled water. So bottled water isn't necessarily always better. In part, it depends on where you live and what's in your water.
And we also talked a little bit with some other speakers that were talking on water quality. And depending on what state you live in, that can determine the quality of your water too. Certain states have better standards. And typically, a lot of the bottled water that you get goes by a national standard, which is not as strict as some of the states. So, are there certain states that you envy that have really good water standards?
So I think everybody brings up California as being a state that has pretty good standards for most chemicals. They have a very active environmental protection, I guess, organization within the state government. They're very proactive and I think kind of set the standard for what states could be doing to protect their citizens from contaminants in various products. North Carolina actually has made very great strides in uncovering PFAS in its water sources, and they're, I believe, one of the first states to have a health advisory for Gen X, one of the PFAS that was discovered in the Cape Fear River of North Carolina. Now, there are some who don't believe that the state has been proactive enough, but I think that they are attempting to move forward to ensure that their citizens are appropriately protected from various chemicals in water and in air. I think the there are some states on both coasts that have been very proactive as well. New Jersey, for example, has been a leader in setting standards for PFAS in its drinking water, and some other states have also enacted some consumer protection laws to help to eliminate PFAS from products and processes. I believe Maine was one of the first states to enact an essential use recommendation for PFAS. So states are getting there. But there are also those states who will just adopt or accept the federal standards rather than being proactive to set standards that are more stringent or are not existent at the federal level.
How can consumers get involved in putting pressure on our legislators or also on corporations? I mean, what are there avenues that you feel people can take to really make a difference to say, "Hey, look, we want you to be more strict or vigilant about these POPs"?
Well, I think with consumer products, your money is going to be what gets the attention, right? So if you don't buy certain products because you don't want to get exposed to the chemicals used by the companies, that will usually get the attention of companies. In terms of decision makers, I've always heard that if you email, call, or write your legislators, that they'll listen and that will lead them to either initiating or supporting certain bills. If they don't hear from their constituents, then they'll either think that there's not a problem or will do what they think is the best interest of constituents. So I'm always in favor of emailing, writing, or calling. I think you can even text now your decision makers at the state level. So know who your decision makers are so that you know who to write, call, text, or email.
You're amazing. So, one takeaway, we like to give our audience a takeaway, something they can do immediately. They've seen you and they say, "Oh gosh, I really want to start doing something right away." Something economical. What would you recommend in a home to make the biggest impact?
Oh, geez, that's actually kind of a tough question. I know one of the things I did was get rid of my plastic cutting boards and replace them with wood cutting boards, and I managed to find some very nice cutting boards on sale from a company that I know has a really good sustainability team and has made strides in eliminating PFAS. Not that there would be any PFAS in the cutting boards, I think. Uh, so something economical that somebody could do today to help to reduce their exposures. Well, I would urge people not to go out and throw everything away, because then that's creating a burden for landfills and for people who might live near landfills. But if you're in the market for new cookware, shop around for cookware that is made without PFAS. Like I said, I use either stainless steel or the cast iron pans that my grandmother got as a wedding present. So they're also of sentimental value. And if you're thinking about, getting a new water bottle, maybe get a metal water bottle or a glass water bottle so that you don't have that plastic in your home. With respect to PFAS as well, if you're trying to replace your carpeting, or if you wanting to get some new textiles, make sure that you get those that are made without PFAS. So ask yourself, does my carpeting really need to be water and stain repellent, or are are there other ways to clean up those day-to-day messes so that I don't have to get exposed to those chemicals, and so that my family doesn't have to get exposed to those chemicals? And I think that there are some processes that some companies can use for yarns in carpeting, for example, that reduce their ability to absorb stains or spills. So again, it requires doing a little bit of homework, but there are some great websites out there to help direct people to companies that have a low chemical profile.
And I think also choosing your furniture. I know I recently bought couches and when they gave you that stain guard option, just opting out, like say, no, my couch is good, just the way it is.
That's
Just
right. That's
fabric and
right.
some wood and foam, though I'm sure couches, foam might be an issue too, because we use a lot of foam now on couches.
And those, I think, are required to have flame retardants in them. So there's, I think, very little we can do to avoid exposure to chemicals. But chemicals also have allowed us to live longer lives. Chemicals have undoubtedly been essential for certain aspects of our lives. We use chemicals to disinfect our water so that we don't get sick from cholera. So
Mhm.
I appreciate judicious and essential use of chemicals, just not the let's use a chemical because. We should have very described and defined reasons for using chemicals, especially in products that we're going to encounter on an everyday basis.
100% agreed. Where can people find out about you, or where do you want to send people who are interested in learning more about persistent organic pollutants, endocrine disruptors, toxicology, all of these things? If you don't want our audience reaching out to you directly because you're busy and busy doing research in the lab, where do you think they can go?
Well, I mentioned the Environmental Working Group. They have really good information on consumer products. I mentioned the tap water database. They also have Skin Deep, which is a way to find out about chemicals in personal care products. There's also an organization called the Green Science Policy Institute that has a lot of information on persistent organic chemicals. They have what's known as a six classes approach. So they focus on six classes of hazardous chemicals. And with those six classes, they have informational videos, and they also have companies and consumer products that have committed to eliminating one or more of the chemicals in those six classes from their products and processes. There's also a research institute called Silent Spring Institute that has good information on PFAS. They work with Northeastern University on a project called PFAS Reach that helps you to understand what your exposure might be and how you can eliminate PFAS from your home through various products. There's also all sorts of research going on at different universities across the country. Many of these research programs are funded by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences through the Superfund Research Program. So somebody could just Google Superfund Research, NIEHS, and you can get centers across the country that are dedicated to understanding effects of both emerging and then legacy or older pollutants. And you can see what different scientists are doing to understand effects of these chemicals. And many of these have what's known as a community engagement core that helps to make scientific information readily available to those who might want to use it to make decisions.
Mm. Well, you are just a plethora of knowledge, and I am honored that you joined us. I am thrilled you joined us. I thank you for educating our audience. This will be during Earth Week, so I think our summit will be very important to making the world a better place, and you're one of the people that's doing that. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it was a real pleasure to be here. And I'm also happy to receive emails if people are interested in what I'm doing in my laboratory.